1920. Britain had just won the First World War and made the most expensive promise in the history of its empire. 67 words signed by Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour and addressed to Lord Rothschild. A national home for the Jewish people, in a territory Britain did not own, promised over the heads of 700,000 people already living there. Britain was broke. Its national debt had exploded from £650 million to nearly £8 billion. The promise was not generosity. It was a transaction. The Balfour Declaration was a banking deal. But a promise is not a country. To turn 67 words into a country on the map, you need land, you need laws, you need money. And you need someone on the ground willing to build the machinery that makes it all irreversible. Britain found that person. He was Jewish, he was a committed Zionist, and the British government gave him the keys to Palestine. The commander of British forces called the appointment highly dangerous. Arab and Christian leaders warned they could not accept responsibility for what would follow. Lord Curzon read the warnings aloud and asked the man to reconsider. He did not reconsider. What this man built in 5 years, without firing a single shot, transferred a territory more effectively than any army could have. And the financial operation that followed him is one of the most methodical land transfers in documented history. Most of it has never been examined as a single connected sequence. This is that story. The man Britain gave the keys. On the 1st of July, 1920, Herbert Samuel stepped off a boat in Palestine and became the most powerful man in the territory. The British government had appointed him High Commissioner. He was the highest civilian authority in a land that was home to 700,000 people. There had been a warning. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson had sent 2 American academics, Henry King and Charles Crane, to Palestine to assess the situation on the ground. The King-Crane Commission interviewed delegations across the territory. Their conclusion was unambiguous. They recommended against unlimited Jewish immigration and against the creation of a Jewish state. They found that nearly 90% of the non-Jewish population opposed the Zionist program. The report was submitted to the Paris Peace Conference. Britain ensured it was never published. It was suppressed for 3 years. By the time it finally appeared in print in 1922, Samuel had already been governing Palestine for 2 years, and the legal restructuring was well underway. Samuel was not a neutral administrator. He had been lobbying for this outcome since 1914. In January 1915, before the Balfour Declaration existed, Samuel had circulated a private memorandum inside the British cabinet arguing that Palestine should become a home for the Jewish people under British protection. He wrote that the land was underpopulated and underdeveloped and could support millions of Jewish immigrants. He had met Chaim Weizmann in November 1914. Weizmann noted in his memoirs that Samuel was already a strong supporter of the cause. Samuel told Weizmann that the Jewish settlers would have to build railways, harbors, a university, a network of schools. He was not describing a possibility. He was describing a plan. Within months of arriving, Samuel began to restructure the legal foundations of the territory. And the first thing he did was appoint his attorney general. The man he chose was Norman Bentwich. Bentwich was a committed Zionist who had been a delegate at the annual Zionist Congress from 1907 to 1912. He had visited Palestine in 1908. And he was now the man responsible for drafting the laws of a territory whose future his own movement had been promised. Bentwich did not waste time. According to the historian Lakowski, he concentrated his efforts on providing Palestine with a set of modern commercial laws that he believed would facilitate economic development and thus attract more Jewish immigration. Those are not the words of a neutral legal officer. Those are the words of a man building financial infrastructure for a project he personally believed in. Between 1920 and 1925, no fewer than 10 land ordinances were passed. The first land transfer ordinance was issued in September 1920. It was the first legal step that allowed the Zionist movement to gain control over large tracts of state land. Under these new laws, for the first time, the concept of land use became legally distinct from land ownership. A Palestinian farmer who had worked the same land for generations but held no Ottoman-era title deed could now lose that land to someone who had never set foot on it. Bentwich kept the Zionist Organization fully informed of every new ordinance while it was still being drafted. The people whose land was being restructured were not consulted. The people whose movement stood to benefit were given advance copies. Samuel also restructured immigration. He developed a quota system based on what the British called the economic absorptive capacity of the territory. The phrase sounded measured and technocratic. In practice, it meant that the number of Jewish immigrants allowed into Palestine each year was determined not by the wishes of the people already living there, but by a bureaucrat's estimate of how many newcomers the economy could absorb. In 1925, a Palestinian nationality law was passed. It granted citizenship to Jewish immigrants on terms so broad that in some cases the normal residency requirements could be waived entirely by the High Commissioner personally. Jewish immigrants were no longer foreigners buying land in someone else's country. They were now citizens with the legal right to purchase property as nationals. By the time Herbert Samuel left Palestine in 1925, the Jewish population had roughly doubled. The legal architecture for transferring land from one population to another was in place. The financial infrastructure for purchasing that land was operational. And the 700,000 people who had been living there before he arrived had not been asked a single question about any of it. Samuel had not conquered Palestine. He had not fired a shot. He had rewritten its laws. If this is the kind of documented financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to this channel. The paper trail in this video has been open for over a century. That was the foundation. The legal architecture was in place. But architecture without money is just paper. What happened next was the financial operation that turned those laws into facts on the ground, and the money came from places that most accounts of this story have never examined together. The money machine. The Jewish National Fund was founded in 1901 at the Fifth Zionist Congress. Its purpose was stated openly from the beginning, to purchase land in Palestine and hold it in perpetual trust for the Jewish people. Not as individual private property, as collective national property that could never be resold. By 1908, the fund had established a subsidiary, the Palestine Land Development Company, to carry out the purchases on the ground. And the purchasing strategy was precise. The company targeted absentee landlords, wealthy families in Beirut, Damascus, and Cairo who owned enormous tracts of Palestinian land but had never lived on it. The Sursak family of Beirut alone owned over 400,000 dunams in the Jezreel Valley, one of the most fertile agricultural regions in the territory. In 1929, they sold it to Baron Rothschild. Between 1920 and 1936, over 55% of the agricultural land acquired by Jewish institutions was purchased from these absentee landlords, families who lived in Lebanon and Syria and had no connection to the people farming the land. Here's the mechanism that mattered. The landlord in Beirut received his payment. The Jewish National Fund received the title deed, and the Palestinian farmer who had worked that land for generations received an eviction notice. In some cases, the fund paid compensation to the displaced tenants. In many cases, the British authorities had classified the farmers as squatters under the new land ordinances that Norman Bentwich had drafted, meaning they had no legal right to compensation at all. The land was purchased legally. Every transaction followed the laws that Herbert Samuel's administration had written. The laws had been written to make exactly this outcome possible. The legality was not in question. The architecture was. By the end of the British Mandate, Jewish institutions owned approximately 1.5 million dunams, around 6% of the total land area. That number sounds small. But the purchases were concentrated in the most strategically important regions: the coastal plain, the Jezreel Valley, the areas around Haifa and Tel Aviv. The financial map of Palestine no longer matched the demographic one. And then in 1933, the money came from a place that should have been unthinkable. On the 25th of August, 1933, a formal financial agreement was signed between the Zionist Federation of Germany, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and the economic authorities of Nazi Germany. It was called the Havara Agreement. The word means transfer in Hebrew. The mechanism worked as follows. A Jewish emigrant leaving Germany deposited their assets into a special blocked account inside Germany. Those funds were used to purchase German-manufactured goods, agricultural equipment, construction materials, industrial machinery. The goods were shipped to Palestine. A company in Tel Aviv called Havara Limited sold the goods on the local market. The proceeds were paid to the emigrant in local currency minus costs and a portion directed to communal development. Between 1933 and 1939, approximately 60,000 German Jews emigrated to Palestine under this agreement. The total value of goods transferred reached 105 million Reichsmarks, approximately $35 million. According to Edwin Black, whose book The Transfer Agreement remains the most detailed account of this arrangement, the Jewish Agency and all Zionist enterprises were facing imminent financial collapse in 1933. Without the Havara Agreement, the financial project of building a state in Palestine would likely have stalled during the Depression years. The agreement tore the Jewish world apart. Abba Hillel Silver and Rabbi Stephen Wise of the American Jewish Congress argued it undermined the anti-Nazi boycott. The 19th Zionist Congress in 1935 narrowly voted to continue the program despite fierce opposition. If you are watching this video and you had never heard of the Havara Agreement before today, say that in the comments. Because this is one of the most documented financial arrangements of the 20th century, and it is almost never discussed alongside the story of how the state was built. Subscribe and I will see you at every paper trail. The legal architecture was in place. The land had been purchased. The population had shifted. But the people living on that land had been watching for 9 years, and in 1929 they stopped watching. The people who paid the price. By 1929, the people of Palestine had been watching the transformation of their territory for 9 years. The land ordinances, the immigration quotas, the purchases, the evictions, in a legal architecture that treated them as a consideration to be managed rather than a population with rights. In August 1929, the tension broke. Violence erupted across the territory. In Hebron, 67 Jewish residents were killed. 133 Jews and 116 Arabs lost their lives. The ancient Jewish community of Hebron that had existed for centuries was destroyed in a single day. Britain sent a commission. The Shaw Commission investigated and found that the fundamental cause was Arab fears about Jewish immigration and land purchases. The recommendations were largely ignored. 7 years later, the situation became uncontainable. In April 1936, the Palestinian population launched a general strike, the longest anti-colonial strike in modern history. It began with boycotts and the withholding of taxes. When these failed, it escalated into a full-armed revolt lasting 3 years. Britain sent another commission. The Peel Commission arrived in November 1936. Lord Peel had served as Secretary of State for India. The other commissioners included senior colonial officials who had governed territories in Africa and Asia. These were men whose careers had been built on administering other people's land. The hearings were extraordinary. Chaim Weizmann, the man who had secured the Balfour Declaration through his acetone chemistry and his access to the British cabinet, testified before the commission. He told the commissioners that there were 6 million Jews in Europe for whom the world was divided into places where they cannot live and places where they cannot enter. That number, 6 million, spoken in 1936. 11 years before the United Nations vote, 9 years before the camps were liberated. The Palestinian leadership testified through the Arab Higher Committee. They made a detailed and precise case for their rights. They told the commissioners how little trust they had in British commitments to fair play. That distrust was based on documented experience. Every previous British commission had investigated, recommended, and been ignored. The Peel Commission also revealed what the mandate was costing. British expenditure on public security in Palestine had risen from £265,000 in 1923 to over £862,000 by 1935. In 1936, the year of the revolt, that figure exploded to £2,230,000. Britain was spending more on policing the promise than the territory was generating in revenue. The Commission published its report in July 1937 with 2 conclusions that would shape everything that followed. First, the mandate was unworkable. The obligations Britain had taken on were irreconcilable. You could not simultaneously build a Jewish national home and protect the rights of the existing majority. The Commission used exactly those words. The gulf between the two communities was already wide and would continue to widen if the present mandate was maintained. Second, the Commission recommended partition. For the first time, a British political body officially endorsed the idea of a Jewish state, not a national home, but a state, and the report recommended that more than 200,000 Palestinians be transferred from their homes to accommodate it. 200,000 people moved to make room for a promise made in 67 words 20 years earlier. The Arab leadership rejected the partition plan outright. The Zionist leadership was divided, but the division was revealing. According to the historian Benny Morris, Ben-Gurion and Weizmann saw partition not as a final settlement, but as a stepping stone to further expansion and the eventual takeover of the whole of Palestine. They accepted the principle of partition publicly, while privately viewing it as a temporary boundary that would not hold. Britain crushed the Arab revolt with methods familiar to anyone who has studied British counterinsurgency in Ireland: mass arrests, house demolitions, executions, collective punishment. Norman Bentwich himself noted in his memoirs that most members of the gendarmerie sent to Palestine had served with the Black and Tans. By 1939, the revolt was crushed. And then Britain made a calculation that revealed exactly how much its promises were worth. The White Paper of 1939 effectively reversed the Balfour Declaration. It limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 over 5 years. It restricted land purchases. It proposed an independent Palestinian state within 10 years. Why? Because war with Germany was coming. Britain needed Arab support across the Middle East for oil, for bases, for strategic depth. The promise made in 1917 to secure Jewish support was now being unmade to secure Arab support for the next war. Ben-Gurion's response was precise. He said they would fight the war as if there were no white paper, and fight the white paper as if there were no war. Britain had spent 19 years building a structure it now wanted to dismantle. The legal architecture was in place, the land had been purchased, and the empire that started it all was about to discover that you cannot reverse a financial operation once the assets have changed hands. What happened next would cost Britain more than it could afford, and end with a haberdasher from Kansas City walking into the White House. The empire trapped. The Second World War changed the calculation permanently. 6 million Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust. By 1945, hundreds of thousands of survivors sat in displaced persons camps across Europe with nowhere to go. Britain, enforcing its own white paper, was turning away ships carrying Holocaust survivors from the shores of Palestine. In July 1947, the most infamous of those ships arrived. The Exodus carried 4,500 Holocaust survivors from Europe to Palestine. The Royal Navy intercepted it. The passengers were forcibly transferred to British transport ships and sent back to Germany, the country they had just survived. Photographs of British soldiers forcing Jewish refugees off the ship at Haifa were published in newspapers around the world. The images did more damage to Britain's international standing than any military defeat. President Truman sent Earl Harrison to inspect the camps. His report was devastating. He wrote that the survivors were living under conditions that in many cases were worse than those in the concentration camps. He recommended immediate immigration to Palestine of 100,000 Jewish refugees. Britain refused, and then the territory became ungovernable. The Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, launched an armed campaign against British forces. On the 22nd of July 1946, they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 91 people were killed. British soldiers were being kidnapped and executed. By 1947, Britain had 100,000 soldiers stationed in Palestine. The territory that the cabinet had been promised would pay for itself was costing £40 million a year and producing nothing but casualties. 750 British military and police personnel had been killed over the course of the mandate. The British public was watching its soldiers die to enforce a promise that had been made 30 years earlier to settle a debt that no longer existed. And here's the financial detail that most accounts leave out entirely. After the war, Britain was not simply tired. It was broke. Again. The war had cost Britain over £25 billion. Its gold and dollar reserves were nearly exhausted. The empire that had entered the First World War as the world's largest creditor nation had now fought 2 world wars in 30 years and come out of both financially destroyed. In 1945, Britain negotiated a $3.75 billion loan from the United States, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. It was Britain's lifeline. Without it, the country could not rebuild, could not feed its population through rationing, could not maintain its position as a world power. The loan negotiations were already difficult. The Americans drove a hard bargain. Britain was forced to accept conditions, including the convertibility of sterling that would later trigger a financial crisis in 1947. And then Palestine made everything worse. When the loan terms reached Congress for ratification, the Palestine situation became a political obstacle. American legislators were watching British soldiers intercept ships carrying Holocaust survivors. They were reading newspaper reports of British troops forcing Jewish refugees back to the camps in Germany. The political appetite to approve billions in loans to an empire that was seen, rightly or wrongly, as standing between Holocaust survivors and safety was limited. Palestine was not just costing Britain soldiers, it was threatening to cost Britain its economic reconstruction. The £40 million a year spent on 100,000 soldiers in Palestine was money Britain did not have, borrowed against a future that depended on American goodwill that Palestine was destroying. On the 14th of February 1947, Britain referred the question of Palestine to the United Nations. The empire that had written 67 words in 1917 was walking away. It could not afford to stay. It could not afford to leave. And it could not afford the consequences of either. The vote and the haberdasher. The United Nations recommended partition, a Jewish state and an Arab state, Jerusalem under international control. The proposed Jewish state received 56% of the territory for a population that owned approximately 6% of the land. The vote was scheduled for the 26th of November 1947. Passage required a 2/3 majority. On that day, the votes were not there. The vote was delayed by 3 days. A Thanksgiving recess was called, and in those 3 days, the most intensive lobbying campaign in the history of the United Nations was launched. Truman's own handwritten notes from a cabinet meeting survive in the Truman Library. They read, "We have been in touch with the Liberian minister to try to get the government's instructions changed to support us. I think we have Haiti. We may get the Philippines out of no into abstention or with luck, yes. The rubber company Firestone warned the government of Liberia that it would reconsider its plans to expand in the country if Liberia did not reverse its vote. The Philippines had voted against partition on the 25th. After a phone call from Washington, the Philippine representative was recalled. The vote was changed. Haiti, the promise of a $5 million loan may have secured its vote. France was warned it risked losing American financial support if it abstained. 26 senators cabled the president of the Philippines directly. 2 Supreme Court justices personally warned President Roxas that the Philippines would isolate millions of American friends and supporters if it continued to vote against. Truman later wrote, "I do not think I ever had as much pressure and propaganda aimed at the White House as I had in this instance." On the 29th of November, Resolution 181 passed, 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The 2/3 threshold was met. Barely. But the vote was not the final act. Recognition was. On the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared independence in Tel Aviv. The question was whether the United States would recognize the new state. Truman's Secretary of State George Marshall was against it. He told Truman that if recognition was granted, he would not vote for him in the coming election. The State Department feared alienating the Arab world and its oil. The Zionist leadership had lost access to the White House. Truman had ordered his staff to stop all meetings with Zionist representatives, and then a man named Eddie Jacobson walked in. Eddie Jacobson was not a diplomat, not a senator, not a banker. He was a haberdasher from Kansas City who had once shared a clothing shop with Harry Truman at 104 West 12th Street. They met in 1905 when Jacobson was 15 and Truman 22. They served together in the First World War. They ran a haberdashery together that failed during the recession. In 37 years of friendship, Jacobson had never asked Truman for a political favor. Not once. On the 13th of March 1948, Jacobson presented himself at the White House. Truman told him, "Eddie, I know what you are here for, and the answer is no." Jacobson said, "Your hero is Andrew Jackson." "I have a hero too. He is the greatest Jew alive. I am talking about Chaim Weizmann. He is an old man and very sick, and he has traveled thousands of miles to see you. And now you are putting him off. This is not like you, Harry." Truman paused. "All right, you bald-headed son of a bitch. You win. I will see Weizmann." 5 days later, Truman met Weizmann in the Oval Office. They spoke for over an hour. Truman committed to recognition. On the 14th of May 1948, 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion declared independence, the United States became the first nation to recognize the State of Israel. The man who made it possible was a clothing shop owner from Kansas City who walked into the White House and reminded his friend to act like his hero. The paper trail. In 1917, a bankrupt empire wrote 67 words to settle a financial obligation. It could not pay any other way. In 1920, it appointed a man to administer the territory whose movement had been promised that territory. That man rewrote the laws. His attorney general leaked the drafts to the beneficiaries before the ink was dry. Over 28 years, a network of financial institutions purchased a territory one contract at a time, from landlords who had never farmed the land, using money that came from collection boxes around the world and from a formal transfer agreement with Nazi Germany. The people living on that land, the 700,000 mentioned only in a subordinate clause, watched it happen through mechanisms they had no power to stop and no seat at the table to challenge. When the existing population resisted, they were crushed. When the empire tried to reverse its own promise, it discovered that financial operations cannot be unwound once the assets have changed hands. When the final vote was taken at the United Nations, the outcome was secured not by moral argument but by rubber contracts and development loans and phone calls from Washington. And when the empire that started it all finally left, it left behind a bombed-out headquarters, 100,000 soldiers, and a bill it had been promised it would never have to pay. The mechanisms were legal. The transactions were documented. The architecture was designed to produce exactly the outcome it produced. That is not a conspiracy. That is a financial operation conducted in plain sight by men who understood leverage and obligation and institutional power, and who never once asked the people most affected whether they consented. The paper trail is open. It has been open for decades. The only question is why so few people have followed it. If this video connected financial mechanisms that are never examined as a single sequence, share it with someone who still believes these were separate events. They were connected by a single piece of paper, 67 words long. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. I will see you in the next one.